When Michael Jordan approaches a young woman outside a luxurious restaurant, his legendary presence and unmistakable charisma turn him into such an attractive conversationalist that every moment feels like an unforgettable scene of pure elegance and allure. The old piano sat in the corner of Lisa's living room like a silent witness to the passage of time. Its yellowed keys hadn't produced a note in over 15 years, not since her husband Thomas died and took all the music with him. At 62, Ellie had grown accustomed to the quiet, to the way her footsteps echoed through the empty rooms of the Victorian home she could no longer afford to maintain. The house, like her, was showing signs of age, peeling wallpaper, creaking floorboards, and memories that clung to every surface like cobwebs. Outside her window, the small town of Mapleton, Vermont was changing. New businesses replaced the familiar storefronts of her youth, and the faces that once greeted her with warm recognition were now mostly strangers. Only the mountains remained constant, their silhouettes etched against the horizon like an unchanging promise. On this particular autumn morning, as golden leaves spiraled down from the maple trees lining her street, Ellie sat at her kitchen table reading a letter that would shatter the delicate equilibrium of her existence. The bank was foreclosing on her home. After years of stretching her late husband's pension and her own meager savings, the financial tightrope she'd been walking had finally snapped. 3 months, she whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 30 years in this house, and they're giving me 3 months to leave. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter along its crisp edges. The thought of leaving the only home she'd shared with Thomas felt like another death, the final erasure of their life together. But beneath the grief, a more immediate concern surfaced. Where would she go? Ellie had no children, her sister lived across the country battling her own health issues, and her closest friend had moved to a retirement community in Florida 2 years ago. The walls of her home, once a sanctuary, now seemed to close in around her, heavy with the weight of an uncertain future. The sharp ring of the doorbell cut through her thoughts. Wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling, Ellie made her way to the front door. Standing on her porch was a young woman with bright copper hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her denim jacket was adorned with colorful patches, and behind wire-rimmed glasses, her eyes held a determined gleam. "Mrs. Maxwell?" the woman asked, extending her hand. "I'm Emily. I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm doing research for my doctoral thesis on the textile mill that used to operate here in town, and I was told you worked there for many years." Ellie studied the young woman's face, noticing the spattering of freckles across her nose and the earnestness in her expression. "That was a lifetime ago," she replied, but stepped aside to let Maya in. Perhaps a distraction from her troubles was exactly what she needed. Little did Ellie know that opening her door to Maya Donovan would set in motion events that would transform not only her life, but the lives of several others in ways none of them could have anticipated. At 34, Maya Donovan was running out of time and options. Her academic advisor had made it clear: finish the dissertation by the end of the semester, or lose the fellowship that kept her financially afloat. 6 years into her PhD program at Boston University, she had changed her topic twice and was now desperately trying to complete research on the social impact of New England textile mills in the mid-20th century. But academic pressure was only half of Maya's burden. Each night, after hours of research and writing, she would call the assisted living facility where her father, James, resided. At 67, he was battling early-onset Alzheimer's, and, with each conversation, Maya could feel him slipping further away. The guilt of being 2 hours from him consumed her, but so did the knowledge that without her degree and a better-paying job, she couldn't afford the quality care he needed. Maya's greatest fear wasn't academic failure, it was that her father would forget her entirely before she could make him proud one last time. As she sat in Ellie Maxwell's living room, notebook open on her lap, Maya tried to focus on the old woman's stories about the mill, but her mind kept drifting to the phone call she'd received that morning. Her father had had a bad night, becoming agitated and confused, calling repeatedly for his late wife and for Maya. "Are you all right, dear?" Ellie's voice broke through her thoughts. "You seem miles away." "I'm sorry," Maya apologized, straightening in her chair. It's just been a difficult morning." Something in her tone must have resonated with Ellie, who set down her teacup and leaned forward. "Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter," she offered gently. The kindness in the older woman's eyes cracked Maya's carefully maintained composure. Before she could stop herself, she was telling Ellie about her father, her academic struggles, and the crushing weight of trying to balance it all. "I feel like I'm failing at everything," Maya admitted, her voice breaking. "My research is stalling, my father is forgetting who I am, and I'm drowning in student loan debt. I can't even afford to visit him more than once a month." Ellie reached across the coffee table and took Maya's hand in her own weathered one. "Life has a way of piling on all at once, doesn't it?" She glanced around her living room at the faded photographs and worn furniture. "I received notice this morning that the bank is foreclosing on my home. After 30 years, I have 3 months to leave and nowhere to go." The two women sat in silence, connected by the unexpected intimacy of shared vulnerability. Then Maya's eyes widened as an idea took shape. "Mrs. Maxwell," she began hesitantly, "this might sound crazy, but what if we helped each other?" Several miles across town, in a sleek downtown office with views of the mountains, Michael Jordan sat staring at the architectural plans spread across his desk. At 42, he had built Sullivan Development into one of the most successful real estate companies in the state, specializing in transforming struggling small towns into tourist destinations. Mapleton was his most ambitious project yet. Carter ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, the only visible sign of the stress he carried. His tailored suit and confident demeanor masked a man who had sacrificed nearly everything for success, including his marriage. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, but the words his ex-wife had hurled at him still echoed. "You tear down history to build soulless replicas, and you've done the same thing to our relationship." A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant, Jessica, entered with a stack of papers. "The bank confirmed that 5 more properties on Maple Street will be in foreclosure by the end of the year," she reported, including the Maxwell place. Carter's expression remained neutral, but inside something shifted uncomfortably. Ellie Maxwell had taught him in 3rd grade. He still remembered how she'd stayed after school to help him with reading when the other kids had teased him about his dyslexia. "Mrs. Maxwell is losing her home?" he asked, his voice carefully professional. Jessica nodded. "According to our contact at the bank, it's perfect timing for phase 2 of the development." Carter turned to the window, looking out at the town he'd grown up in and was now systematically reimagining. The old Victorian homes along Maple Street were central to his vision. A charming, historic district converted into upscale bed and breakfasts and boutique shops. The projected revenue was substantial, and the investors were eager. "Set up a meeting with Mrs. Maxwell," he said finally. "I want to make her an offer personally." What Carter didn't say was that seeing his former teacher might help quiet the voice that had been growing louder lately, the one questioning whether success built on the displacement of others was success at all. The arrangement had seemed simple enough when Maya proposed it. She would move into Ellie's spare bedroom, providing rent money to help with the mortgage payments and offering companionship and assistance around the house. In return, Ellie would share her knowledge of the mill and town history for Maya's research. It wasn't a permanent solution for either of them, but it bought them time. 2 weeks into their arrangement, both women were adjusting to the rhythms of shared living. Maya had set up a small office in the corner of her bedroom where she worked late into the night. Ellie found herself cooking for 2 again, rediscovering recipes she hadn't prepared since Thomas died. On a cool Saturday morning, as they sat together on the front porch drinking coffee, Ellie noticed Maya checking her phone repeatedly. "Expecting a call?" she asked. Maya sighed. "I was supposed to visit my dad today, but my car's making a strange noise, and I don't think it would make the round trip." Ellie set down her mug. "We could take my car. It's not much to look at, but Thomas kept it in good condition, and I rarely use it these days." Maya's eyes widened. "You'd drive me to see my dad?" "Better than that," Ellie replied with a small smile. "We'll both go. It's been too long since I had a proper outing." The drive to Green Valley Assisted Living took just under 2 hours. As they traveled, Maya explained more about her father's condition. "Some days he's almost himself," she said, watching the landscape blur past the window. "Other days, he doesn't recognize me at all. The not knowing what version of him I'll find is almost worse than the certainty of loss." Ellie kept her eyes on the road. "After Thomas died, I used to wake up every morning and, for just a moment, forget that he was gone. Then the memory would hit me all over again. Eventually, I realized it wasn't the loss that was unbearable. It was the hope beforehand that broke my heart each time." When they arrived, they found Michael Jordan sitting in the facility's garden, a chessboard set up before him with no opponent. He was a tall man, still handsome despite the confusion that clouded his eyes. "Dad," Maya called softly as they approached, "I brought someone to meet you." James looked up, his expression vacant at first, then slowly warming. "Maya," he said, and the relief in her face was palpable. It was a good day. Ellie hung back, giving them a moment of privacy until Maya beckoned her forward and introduced them. "Do you play?" James asked, gesturing to the chessboard. "My husband was the player in our family," Ellie replied, "but he tried to teach me." James smiled, a flash of his former charm breaking through. "Sit down, I'll remind you how the pieces move." As Maya watched her father and Ellie engage in a slow game of chess, something inside her uncoiled. For the first time in months, she didn't feel solely responsible for her father's happiness. The sight of him explaining chess moves to Ellie with patience that had once been a hallmark of his personality brought tears to her eyes. Later, as they prepared to leave, James took Ellie's hand. "You remind me of someone," he said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "A good someone, I hope," Ellie replied gently. "My wife," he said after a moment. "She had kind eyes too." In the car ride home, both women were quiet, processing the day in their own ways. Finally, Maya spoke. "Thank you for coming with me. It's been a long time since I've seen him that engaged." Ellie nodded. "He's a remarkable man. You can see it, even through the illness." "He was a history professor," Maya said. "That's why I went into history too. I wanted to be like him." She paused. "The irony is now I'm racing to finish this degree that he might never understand I've earned." Ellie thought about her own regrets. The children she and Thomas had never had, the travels they'd postponed until retirement, only for Thomas to die at 58 from a sudden heart attack. "We make plans," she said softly, "and life happens anyway." When they returned to the house, there was a sleek black car parked in the driveway. A tall man in an expensive suit stood on the porch, looking out at the street with his back to them. "Who's that?" Maya asked as they pulled up. Ellie squinted through the windshield, then inhaled sharply. "Carter Sullivan," she said, recognizing her former student despite the years. "He owns the development company that's been buying up properties all over town." A knot formed in her stomach. There was only one reason Carter Sullivan would be waiting on her porch, and it had everything to do with the foreclosure notice sitting on her kitchen table. Carter hadn't expected the complicated emotions that washed over him when Ellie Maxwell stepped out of the car. She was smaller than he remembered, more fragile looking, but her eyes held the same directness that had once compelled a struggling 8-year-old boy to believe he could overcome his reading difficulties. "Mrs. Maxwell," he greeted her, extending his hand. "It's been a long time." "Carter," she replied, taking his hand briefly. "You've done well for yourself." There was no accusation in her tone, but he felt defensive nonetheless. "I have," he agreed. "Mapleton has a lot of potential. That's actually why I'm here." "Ellie," introduced Maya, who regarded him with undisguised suspicion before inviting him inside. The interior of the house was exactly as Carter remembered from the one time he'd visited for a class party in elementary school. Warm, slightly worn, and filled with books. Settling into an armchair, Carter launched into his prepared pitch. "I understand the bank has initiated foreclosure proceedings. I'd like to offer you a solution that would benefit us both. Sullivan Development is prepared to purchase your home for 20% above market value, allowing you to leave with a significant sum rather than facing foreclosure. Ellie's expression remained neutral. And what would become of the house? Carter hesitated. It would be renovated and converted into a boutique inn as part of our historic district development. You mean gutted and turned into something unrecognizable? Maya interjected, her voice sharp. Carter shifted his attention to her. Our renovations preserve the historical character while updating the functionality. We're not destroying these homes, we're giving them new life. By displacing the people who give them their current life, Maya countered. Ellie raised a hand to quiet them both. The house is being foreclosed on regardless of my wishes, she said pragmatically. Carter's offer is generous. But this is your home, Maya protested. A home I can no longer afford, Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. She turned back to Carter. I appreciate the offer, but I'll need time to consider it. Carter nodded, standing to leave. Of course, the offer stands for 2 weeks. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. Call me when you decide. As he walked to his car, Carter felt unsettled. He had made similar offers to dozens of homeowners over the years, but none had affected him like this one. The look in Ellie's eyes, resignation mixed with dignity, had stirred something he'd long suppressed, doubt about the human cost of his success. Back inside, Maya was pacing the living room. You can't seriously be considering his offer, she said to Ellie. I don't have many options, Ellie replied. The arrangement with you helps, but it's not enough to save the house long term. And even if it were, where would you go once your research is finished? Maya stopped pacing. What if we found a way to save the house and help my dad at the same time? The idea had come to Maya in a flash of inspiration. Convert part of Ellie's spacious home into a small assisted living space for her father and potentially 1 or 2 other seniors. James's long-term care insurance would cover his care, creating steady income for Ellie. Maya could finish her dissertation while helping care for her father, and Ellie could remain in her home. It was an elegant solution in theory. In practice, it required navigating a labyrinth of zoning laws, healthcare regulations, and renovations they couldn't afford. We need professional advice, Ellie admitted after they'd spent hours researching online, and money for the initial renovations. Maya drummed her fingers on the table. What about Carter Sullivan? He knows real estate and has connections at the bank. Ellie looked skeptical. Carter wants to buy the house, not help us keep it. Yes, but you were his teacher. You helped him when he needed it. Maybe he'd be willing to return the favor. The next day, they requested a meeting at Carter's office. Surrounded by architectural models and development plans, they outlined their idea. Let me get this straight, Carter said when they finished. You want me to help you navigate zoning laws so you can convert your home into a small assisted living facility, potentially derailing my plans for that entire street. We're asking you to help a former teacher keep her home while creating a solution that benefits vulnerable seniors, Maya countered. Surely Sullivan Development can afford to exclude one property from its plans. Carter leaned back in his chair, studying the 2 women. It's not that simple. There are investors, timelines, the overall vision for the development. Vision, Maya interrupted. Is that what you call it when you destroy the character of a town for profit? Carter's expression hardened. I'm improving this town, creating jobs, attracting tourists, increasing property values. For whom? Maya challenged. Not for the people who've lived here their whole lives and can no longer afford to stay. Ellie, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Carter, do you remember what I told you in 3rd grade when you were struggling to read aloud and the other? Children laughed. Carter's expression changed, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his professional facade. You said that the measure of a person isn't their ability, but their persistence in the face of difficulty. And that kindness matters more than achievement, Ellie added softly. I've watched your achievements from afar, Carter. You've built something impressive, but I wonder about the kindness. The room fell silent. Carter stood and walked to the window looking out at the town spread below them. Finally, he turned back. "I can't promise anything," he said, "but I'll look into the zoning issues and speak to some contacts about the renovations you'd need." Over the next few weeks, an unlikely alliance formed. Carter, to the surprise of his staff, began spending evenings at Ellie's house, reviewing renovation plans and making calls to zoning officials and contractors he knew. Maya used her academic research skills to navigate the regulatory requirements for small assisted living facilities. During these evenings, the three began to see different sides of each other. Carter observed the easy companionship that had developed between Ellie and Maya, so different from the sterile interactions that filled his professional life. Maya saw glimpses of the boy Ellie had once taught in Carter's occasional unguarded moments, and Ellie watched the gradual thawing between the two younger people with quiet amusement. One evening, as they sat on the porch after hours of work, Carter asked about Maya's dissertation. "It's about more than just the textile mill now," she admitted. "It's about community resilience in the face of economic change, how towns like Mapleton adapt when industries leave." Carter nodded thoughtfully. "My father lost his job when the mill closed. It changed him, broke something in him that never really healed." "Is that why you left town after high school?" Ellie asked. "Partly," Carter replied. "I wanted to build something that couldn't be taken away, something permanent." Maya looked at him closely. "Yet you're in the business of taking away other people's permanence." Instead of bristling, Carter considered her words. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted. "I saw it as progress, not loss." The project hit its first major obstacle when the bank refused to halt the foreclosure proceedings, despite Carter's intervention. The timeline suddenly compressed. They had 6 weeks to secure funding for the renovations and navigate the permit process. "There's another option," Carter said during an emergency meeting in Ellie's kitchen. "I could buy the house personally, not through the company, and lease it back to you for the assisted living facility." Maya shook her head. "That just makes us dependent on you instead of the bank." "Not if we structure it right," Carter argued. "A lease with an option to buy once the facility is profitable. I'm trying to help, Maya." "Why?" she challenged. "What do you get out of this?" Carter looked away, then back at them both. "Maybe I'm trying to preserve something too." Since the day James Donovan moved into the newly renovated east wing of Ellie's house was bright and clear, the Vermont mountains vivid against a blue October sky. The renovations had been completed in record time, thanks to Carter calling in every favor he was owed from contractors across the state. The house now featured wider doorways, an accessible bathroom, a small kitchenette, and a separate entrance for what they were calling Maxwell House Senior Living, a name that made Ellie laugh every time she heard it. James seemed confused by the move at first, but as Maya showed him around the garden, explaining that this was his home now, that she would be nearby, his agitation eased. Carter watched from the porch, feeling strangely emotional at the sight. His own father had died alone in a state facility years ago, with Carter too busy building his company to visit often. "It's a good thing you've done," Ellie said, joining him on the porch. Carter shook his head. "It's a small thing, one house saved when dozens of others will still be converted." Ellie studied him. "It's never too late to reconsider a path, Carter, even a successful one." Later that evening, as Maya helped her father settle into his new room, Ellie found Carter sitting at the old piano in the living room, running his fingers over the dusty keys without pressing them. "Thomas used to play every evening," she said, sitting beside him on the bench. "After he died, I couldn't bear to hear music in the house." Carter pressed one key softly, the note hanging in the air between them. "My development plan includes demolishing the old community center where I took piano lessons as a kid," he said quietly. "I didn't think twice about it until now." "What's changed?" Ellie asked, though she suspected she knew. "I'm not sure," Carter admitted. "Something about being back in this house, seeing you and Maya and her father." He trailed off. The development would still be profitable with some modifications, preserving certain buildings, focusing on renovation rather than replacement, maybe even incorporating affordable housing. Ellie smiled, hearing the teacher in her own voice as she said, "That sounds like a vision worth working toward." Tut. Months later, on a spring afternoon, Ellie sat in her garden watching Maya work on her laptop, while James tended to a small vegetable patch they had planted together. The third resident of Maxwell House, an 80-year-old retired librarian named Dorothy, was reading in the shade of a maple tree. The house mortgage had been restructured through a community development bank that Carter had introduced them to. The assisted living facility was small, just 3 residents including James, but it was enough to keep the house and provide personalized care. Maya had successfully defended her dissertation the previous week, earning her PhD with a thesis that had evolved to include a case study of community-centered development in Mapleton. She had accepted a teaching position at the local community college, allowing her to continue living with Ellie and caring for her father. And Carter. Carter had surprised everyone, including himself. After presenting a radically revised development plan to his investors, one that preserved historic buildings, incorporated affordable housing, and created a community land trust to prevent displacement, he had faced significant pushback. Rather than compromise, he had bought out their shares, taking on personal financial risk to pursue a different kind of legacy. The sound of a car in the driveway drew Ellie's attention. Carter emerged, looking less polished than his former self in jeans and a casual shirt, carrying a stack of folders. "The zoning board approved the community land trust," he announced as he joined them in the garden. "And the old mill building will be converted into mixed-income apartments and a museum about the town's textile history." Maya looked up from her laptop with a smile that had become increasingly common when Carter was around. "That's fantastic. The museum would be perfect for expanding the oral history project I've started with the seniors." Carter sat down on the garden bench beside Ellie, watching as Maya went to share the news with her father, who was having a remarkably lucid day. "I never expected any of this," he admitted to Ellie. "I had my entire future mapped out, and now you're building something truly permanent," Ellie finished for him. "Community." As the afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the garden, Ellie felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before Thomas died. Her home was full again, not just with people, but with purpose. The foreclosure notice that had once threatened to shatter her world had instead opened it up, connecting her to these people who had become a chosen family. Through facing potential loss, they had all found something unexpected. Not just a house saved or a career redirected, but a deeper understanding of what truly makes a home. Later that evening, for the first time in 15 years, Ellie opened the piano. Her fingers were stiff and unpracticed, but as she played the simple melody Thomas had taught her long ago, the notes floated through the house, no longer echoes of what was lost, but promises of what could still be.